Conoce las historias de las personas que son parte del cambio para proteger nuestro planeta. Esto es Sustentablemente. Conversaciones que inspiran. Un podcast original de Radio Pauta. Con Carolina Escobar.
Esta semana en el podcast Sustentablemente les tenemos un especial. Claro, porque los bonos de carbono no dejan de hacer noticia y el mercado que los regula está en constante evolución. Es por eso que quisimos hacer un especial respecto de esta temática. En mi paso por el Latin American Climate Summit, que se realizó este año en Cartagena de Indias, en Colombia, quisimos hablar con los principales actores y representantes para lograr entender hacia dónde van, cuáles son las proyecciones, qué es lo que se está poniendo, dónde se está poniendo mayor foco en este momento. Y es por eso que quienes estamos en el mundo de la sostenibilidad queremos que se pueda entender realmente de qué se trata. Por otro lado, muchas veces pecamos de hablar con siglas, asumir que hay muchos conceptos a los cuales nos referimos que son conocidos y manejados por todos, que no necesariamente es así. Y es ahí donde hay un tremendo error, sobre todo comunicacional, porque se aleja a quienes podrían estar interesados, ya sea en las temáticas o en este caso en las inversiones relacionadas con el cuidado del planeta. Cambiemos eso. Y es por eso que los invito entonces a este especial de esta semana en el que primero vamos a escuchar y ver, para quienes nos están viendo a través de pauta.cl o de Spotify, la primera conversación que tuvimos. Se trata del CEO de IETA, es Dirk Forrister, y esto fue lo que nos comentó.
Dirk Forrister, thank you so much for being with us today. And a pleasure to be here with you in Cartagena, in Colombia. And I'd love to know, and to just bring down to earth many of the concepts that we've been hearing within the summit here. So if you could just explain real quick, or not that quick, but what the carbon market is and the carbon credits are.
So it's a use of a policy tool that seems quite elegant, but at its core it is kind of simple. And what it is that in dealing with climate change, emissions are spread across many, many activities. And typically a policy needs to cap the emissions and drive them down to an acceptable level. And that approach can be done through pricing system that taxes emissions and tries to drive them down, or you can directly set the cap on the emissions themselves and allow all of the companies that are being capped to do so at a different pace. So some will go faster, some will go slower. And the ones that go faster may have extra reductions that they have achieved in a given year that they could sell to someone else to help pay for the equipment that they've installed, to basically do it in collaboration. And this is, in a way, how businesses cooperate across sectors, across borders, in everyday life, is they cooperate through markets. That's what we do. That's how you buy clothes, or you buy a computer or an iPhone or whatever. So we're just applying that logic to reducing pollution and saying everybody gets a certain amount that they're required to do, or allowed to do, but they can do it on timing that makes sense from them and do it in cooperation with others inside a kind of a bubble. There's also an element of it, though, that creates carbon credits from companies that aren't in that bubble, and we typically call those carbon credits. And they have to go through a different set of criteria, a different set of proofs, and they have to make sure that they're real and that they're measured well, and that they are that there's an external verification by a third party that verifies that all of the criteria have been met, and that they've been registered with an independent crediting standard that is independent. All of these are checks and balances in the system so that you know that you're getting something that's reliable in terms of a carbon credit. In the case of Chile, it's got a carbon tax program that recognizes, for some portion of compliance, the external carbon credits, because it broadens the reach of the program to a sector like forestry or agriculture that wouldn't be covered by the program, but may have really cost-effective actions that could take place that would benefit communities and that can be measured, can meet all of those criteria.
What is the role of IETA in all this world?
So IETA is an association of businesses that believe in this solution, but we're trying to professionalize it. So it's both those companies that have an emissions problem where they're emitting too much and they know it and they need to reduce emissions, and they're involved in these governmental programs. But some of them even go beyond that to take voluntary action. So there's a whole set of providers of voluntary services inside of IETA. There are banks inside of IETA, exchanges like brokerages. So it's a wide food chain of all the companies that are that make the markets work in practice. And we have about 350 members around the world, but they're big names from finance and energy that people would recognize as being major players. In mining, Rio Tinto is one of our members, or oil and gas is Chevron and Shell and BP and Total. It's like a wide range. And then in banking, Bank of America and Commerce Bank from Germany, and Goldman Sachs is a member. Like, there's just a lot of sort of name brand companies that are part of IETA for the little bit of work that they may be involved in their grand business related to carbon markets as a solution to climate change.
Dirk, and how do you build those trust in a world where you don't even trust in the videos that you see or the voices that you hear anymore because of AI, for instance?
So our goal ultimately is that we want governmental systems to be set up. And so what Chile's done in setting up its carbon tax, they're now working on an emissions trading program that will complement what they're doing with the tax. That provides clarity and certainty. Everybody knows what the rules are from the public. It's elected officials. That's the best approach. That's what we want. But a lot of the things that you hear about causing mistrust are in the voluntary side of the market, where companies they're trying to mimic what they think governments ought to do and ultimately will do, but trying to do it, creating the sort of following best practice standards that are set by market participants themselves or NGOs that come together. And an example of that is in carbon credits themselves. There are several independent standards that create the standard that you measure and verify against, and that actually review and approve and issue the credits. There's now been a threshold standard set across all of those to make sure that they are all abiding by the same high quality rules, so that everybody can have an additional sense of confidence in it. And that's called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. A mouthful, but what it really is trying to do is provide a further assurance that even though these individual systems have their own checks and balances, there's now an international threshold that all of them need to aspire to meet. And our IETA members, sorry, I hit my microphone, but all of our IETA members will prefer to buy those types of credits as they become available in the market, because they're through an extra rigorous process.
Well, you know what, and I have so many more questions regarding those, but for instance, the insurance companies should come along with what is going on right now?
Absolutely. Insurance companies have many roles to play, partly in sort of providing backing for some of the projects. In case something goes wrong with the project, they can step in and ensure the deliveries coming off of it. And they're also exposed because of the risks that they're insuring related to climate change. So I think they have a vested interest in getting involved in carbon market and providing services.
And do you see other actors within the market that should get involved in order to just make it more transparent and more confident for big companies to get in, and for small eco entrepreneurs, for instance?
I mean, it is a space that is exciting for entrepreneurs, because there are new technologies coming along all the time. Everybody's working on ways to to produce energy using less and less less and less carbon intensive. Let's say that, so that we really have lasting and enduring change. And the combination, what a market does is brings together the technology that's being innovated, the financing to achieve it, and the practical application of it. And often that's fitting within a specific policy, which helps buttress the whole thing with security. But I think on this journey on climate change, we're going to see a lot of entrepreneurs, but also we've been seeing this in the last 3 years, more and more financial players as insurers, but not just insurers, also just banks in different parts of the world that realize that climate change is an area that public needs confidence that businesses are doing what they should be doing in protecting the planet.
And then how do you foresee the next 5 years, for instance?
Well, I think as we approach the Paris benchmark years, like a 2030 year is an important one, and 2050 is the year by which we're supposed to be carbon neutral. So that's a tough journey. Like, we're in the easy part now. It's going to get tougher and tougher. And what I mean by that is we'll need more and more actors involved. I'm expecting the innovations to come along on technology front, which can hopefully draw more and more people in. The role of nature-based solutions, I think, is going to be incredibly high. There'll be ways to produce, agricultural products or forestry products in ways that benefit the climate because they keep that, or they pull carbon out of the air naturally, and we need to learn how to measure and verify those with the same level of gusto that we use with a technology-based reduction. But I just think I think the whole market is going to continue to expand, and by our numbers had showed that we've done economic modeling of this, that it should be in the neighborhood of a 200 to 300 billion a year market in that era of the 2030s and building up to $1 trillion by the 2050s. So it's important. Yeah,
it's key, actually. Dirk, and just before we end here, is how do you measure the success of a summit like this one? So the Latin America Climate Summit here going on in Bogota, in Cartagena, in Colombia, could be questioned by saying, sure, they all get together, they have wonderful conferences, but what is the takeaways? What you expect to happen after this?
Well, there's certainly an educational component, and that's first and foremost is really about informing people and bringing them up to date on how many things are happening. There's 14 different country programs in Latin America on carbon pricing. So either carbon tax or carbon trading, but they all have a trading element to them. That's a lot to keep up with. It's hard for me to keep up with it. So I know for the corporates that live and work in these markets, you drill into one and you think you've about got it, and then you, like in the session earlier today, you're really fascinated with what's going on in Colombia, but you also need to know what's going on next door in Panama, because there's fascinating things happening and business opportunities. But what I wanted to say is that's only part of the story. The real reason that people come to these conferences is to make business connections so that they might work together. They might come up with investment strategies together. They may have a project idea that's lacking investment, and you've got a guy with the idea and you've got a guy with money, and they'll meet up here. So that's one of the real purposes, is all of the business connections that are made and the what I think of as the cool ideas that come out of it that people can take back home and implement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Luego continuamos la conversación con Andrea Abraham. Ella es VMC de... Voy de nuevo. 3, 2. Luego continuamos la conversación con Andrea Abraham. Ella es VMC Managing Director de IETA. Y esto fue lo que nos dijo, sobre todo adentrándonos en lo que son los artículos que regulan, de acuerdo al Acuerdo de París, las transacciones entre países y también entre privados. Miren.
Very specifically, we can look at the role that carbon markets can play in a compliance environment, so with governments, or we could look at it also in a voluntary carbon market. Now, thinking a little bit more about what that means, let's go back to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is an agreement between parties, and those parties are countries. So it's an agreement between countries to decarbonize the world and to ensure that we meet our climate goals as the planet. But if we uncouple that a little bit and we think further, if you take a single country, there's many parties in that country who are contributing towards the emissions of that country. You and me, companies, forests. So there's a lot of activities within a country that contribute towards the emissions of that country, the greenhouse gas emissions of that country. And that's why it's so important that you and companies get involved in playing their role to help decarbonize and help the country achieve its Paris agreements. So how can companies do that? Let's think a little bit more about companies. And this brings in the concept of what we call the voluntary carbon market. So let's start first of all with the company. So how do they do it? So an industrial company, as an example, will have a lot of emissions associated with running that business, creating the products, importing the materials it requires to create its products, even selling the products, transporting the products. All of these create greenhouse gas emissions. For a company to reduce those emissions, it needs to invest in renewable energy, lower carbon forms of technology, replace some kit with other kit that's lower carbon. It's a whole lot of actions that need to be taken. Some of these actions are potentially easy because there's already renewable energy available, so you can just switch. But some of those activities are extremely difficult to do for a number of reasons. They can be very expensive, the technology may not be available, or you could produce low carbon products but your customers don't want to buy them because they're too expensive. You know, like electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are more expensive. So not everybody can afford to do that. And so there are limitations on what a company can do, as there are limitations on a country. So we agree that they need to happen, but there are limitations on the pace that you can make them happen. And this is where companies need a little bit of help. And that help can come through the carbon market. So how could that work? What the carbon market allows you to do as a company is to invest in carbon reduction activities that are possible today, but are not within your own company. So you need to do your company activities first, but where you've exhausted that, then you can also invest in activities which reduce emissions outside of your business carbon footprint. And that's good for all of us. That's good for the world because somebody is investing or ensuring that emission reduction happens. It wouldn't occur without that support and with that finance. So it's ensuring it happens and ensuring it happens more quickly. And what we really need to help deliver Paris is that we reduce emissions as quickly as possible. We are behind, so we need to reduce as quickly as possible. So that's what we call the voluntary carbon market. It's where companies invest in emission reductions. They invest in financing emission reductions outside of their carbon footprints, which would not otherwise occur.
And in that sense, Andrea, the traceability that you may have and want in order to make those invest in those projects, but also make sure that those happen the right way, and that it's balancing what your emissions are. What are the best possibilities? How do companies can, again, trust, right? That's what we're trying to build.
Yeah. No, it's a brilliant question, and I would split it into two because the one part of your question touches on supply, the supply of credits, and how do we ensure the integrity of those credits. The other side touches on how companies use those credits. So if you like, it's on the demand side.
Sure.
And both of those you need to be able to trust it. So let's start with the supply side. So a company is not going to take their money and go and invest in an activity if they can't be absolutely sure that activity is going to do what it says on the tin, which is reduce a ton of carbon, pay for a ton of, if you're paying for a ton of carbon to be reduced or removed, that's actually occurred. And that, on top of that, there's been no knock-on negative impacts of that activity happening. So for example, if there are people employed in creating that activity, those people are employed correctly and paid correctly. If the communities involved in the area where that activities happen, those communities have been consulted and are part of the process. So there's a lot of activities that have to take place to ensure that not only has that emission reduction or removal occurred exactly as intended, but also there's been no negative impacts of that, consequences of that activity. So there's lots of initiatives underway and checks and balances in the carbon market that help make sure that that occurs. The system itself has checks and balances. It has auditors. It has methodologies to make sure that the process is sort of defined, set out, that we can be comfortable that it happens. And secondly, there are new initiatives which are setting out a rule book to help us all understand what good looks like and to follow this new rule book, like the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market. So that's on the supply side. The second part of your question is, how does a company use those credits? So again, you're only going to invest as a company if it's good for your business, because companies have a responsibility to do what's right for their company. So it's great to invest in those credits if it makes sense for you as a company. How and why would it make sense? It would make sense if you can count that activity against your own climate targets. So if by investing in an emission reduction that's occurring elsewhere in the world, you can count that emission reduction towards your own targets, it helps you achieve your targets. So that makes a lot of sense. Or if there are other incentives, like potentially tax breaks that countries may offer to companies, that again would make financial sense to that company to take that initiative.
And towards the biggest challenges companies may have, we've heard during the summit here in Cartagena a lot about Article 6, 6.2, 6.4. What to you are the biggest challenges regarding that matter within the region?
So I think the voluntary carbon market and Article 6 markets, first of all, can be very complementary, as well as what you already have in this region, where you have carbon pricing schemes which allow for carbon crediting mechanisms or carbon offset projects to work within that carbon tax scheme. Now that's a very helpful starting place for Article 6, because what it does is it builds the capacity and knowledge in a country on what is a carbon credit, how's a carbon credit project developed, back to what does good look like. It helps you understand what good looks like, set up registries, develop the auditor, the VVB process. So it helps you build that whole infrastructure. And then as countries are starting to get their heads around, okay, how does Article 6.2 work in my country? How does Article 6.4 work? How does, why is it important to help my country deliver my Paris goals? In the meantime, you're using the market to create knowledge, capacity, and infrastructure. So I think that's a very useful and pragmatic way for countries to think about it in Latin America.
Wonderful. Andrea, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
Ya va quedando todo más claro, ¿no? Pero aquí queremos ver un poquitito la proyección que se hace. Y es ahí donde nos sentamos a conversar con Lourie. Ella es Director of... Voy de nuevo. 3, 2... Ya va quedando más claro todo el concepto y cómo se maneja, ¿no? Vamos a ver ahora cuáles son las principales trabas, piedras de tope y cómo se hace una proyección de los bonos de carbono. Lourie, Director of Natural Climate Solutions and Aviation para el International Emission Trading, nos comentó sobre un estudio que acaba de salir del horno y que estaban publicando en ese momento en pos de que la gran mayoría de los privados y también de los países logren sumarse y entender los mercados de carbono.
So, Ellen, thank you so much for talking to us today, and especially with this report, the urgent need to finance natural climate solutions, that I understand is launched today.
Yes.
Okay,
right.
tell us about it.
Yeah, so at IETA, I lead our Natural Climate Solutions Working Group. So it's a group of members of IETA who are all businesses working in carbon markets, but particularly who are working in nature and natural climate solutions. So there's a big interest in that group to ensure that there's, sufficient finance to protect and restore nature. And of course, in that group as well, a belief that carbon markets are an important part of that solution. I think a lot of the urgency came from the fact that there's a concern that there aren't sufficient incentives or very obvious or clear incentives right now for the business community to put their money towards nature. But in our mind, we thought, well, we know what the incentives are. So let's try to put that in one, short, concise paper and really make the case for businesses. Here's why you need to be putting your money towards natural climate solutions.
Do you think that it's an economic incentive? Is it an understanding challenge? What is the biggest challenge to you right now?
I think it's a bit of an understanding challenge. I think, I don't know if you've heard the term green hushing.
Yeah.
But, I think it's a little bit
But not necessarily everybody has. So
no, not necessarily. Yeah. And so, that's a term that's basically, it means companies are concerned about taking climate action because of the backlash that they can sometimes get because of,
doing or not doing.
Yeah. But you may have talked to Andrea about it earlier, but, a lot of businesses who are taking action are the ones who get the most backlash. And then there are a lot of businesses out there who aren't doing anything, but it's almost, considered to be safer to not stick your neck out in that regard. And I think the other thing is, there's a lot of guidance and, initiatives and frameworks out there, but trying to piece that together, I think, as a business sometimes isn't so clear. And so we wanted to make a very clear case here for why you need to invest in nature.
And then regarding that, what is the strategy that for you guys is the most efficient one? So decision makers should know about it and just filter that down to the rest of the company, or is the other way around, or is it a more technical area that needs to be aware of it that would just show to the rest of it?
Yeah, interesting. I think probably, at least in the work that I'm doing at IETA, I hope that, we have some printed copies of these at this conference. And so I think it probably will be a bit of the sort of bottom up approach in the sense that there may be people here who are more technical experts or, have a particular role within their company, and they can communicate, to the more senior level why it's important for the company as a whole to be investing in nature.
Well, wonderful. I really hope that, and when you talk about urgency, time-wise, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so there's a few, reasons we see there's an urgency with nature in particular. I think one of the things is, the concept of irrecoverable carbon, which is basically, if there are all these beautiful, amazing old growth standing forests, and if we lose those forests, there's no way that we can recover the carbon that exists and stored within those trees in a time frame that's meaningful, in a net zero sort of 2050 kind of time frame. So that's quite urgent, right? We need to make sure those trees stay standing. And then I think too, there continues to be a really big finance gap for nature and climate. And so there's a certain urgency that businesses sort of start to take action now, right, to close that gap. And nearly 2030, before we know it, it's 2050. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and your knowledge, and best of luck. So hopefully everybody will just reach out and get to know the market and understand the urgency of it.
Certainly hope so. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
You.
Y finalmente, Alex Saer, CEO de Cercarbono, fue quien nos dio una exclusiva respecto de la presencia de empresas, en este caso como la suya, como Cercarbono, en el mercado latinoamericano, pero también global. Y cómo es pionera en un modelo que va de la mano de empresas aseguradoras que por primera vez se suman a este tipo de transacciones. Alex Saer, CEO, director general de Cercarbono, muchísimas gracias por conversar con nosotros hoy. Y sé que tienen un gran anuncio, algo que es inédito, y corrígeme si estoy mal, pero a nivel mundial.
Tal cual.
Cuéntanos de qué se trata.
Gracias, Carolina, y gracias por la invitación de hacer parte de este espacio. El anuncio de hoy es muy importante. Son los primeros créditos de carbono del sector uso de la tierra en ser asegurados a nivel mundial. Y eso es un poco un hito dentro del sector del mercado de carbono, porque le da la garantía al comprador de que esos créditos son unos créditos de calidad, que son unos créditos íntegros, que siguieron todos los procesos, que cumplieron con todas las normas, que cumplieron con la actividad, y que prácticamente si llegase a suceder algo con esos créditos que no sea una conformidad para el comprador, el seguro le responde al comprador con un dinero para poder reembolsar, le reembolsa en dinero los créditos.
Y ahí, Alex, me imagino que, a lo largo del tiempo, esto no se logra de un día para otro. Esto no es algo como que llegó una aseguradora, las contactaron ustedes y se pudo certificar y se pudieron querer hacer parte, ¿no? Porque en definitiva están arriesgando, me imagino, poco, con lo cual hubo todo un proceso anterior muy largo para poder llegar a este punto. ¿Cómo se crean las confianzas? Algo tan importante hoy y tan complejo en este mundo hoy.
Una pregunta muy importante. Mira, esto ha sido un proceso, digamos, que ha tomado cerca de 8 meses aproximadamente. El proyecto que nosotros tenemos asegurado, que el primer proyecto, es un proyecto de una compañía que se llama Mir Plantation, que está ubicada en Ghana. Okay. Es un proyecto de reforestación. Pero lo primero y la base de poder haber iniciado todo este proceso es la forma como se desarrolló este proyecto, ¿no? Y cómo este proyecto pudo cumplir de manera satisfactoria todas las reglas de Cercarbono y todo el marco normativo de Cercarbono. Y la rigurosidad que se hizo en todo el proceso de certificación de Cercarbono. Ellos, en esa confianza, empezaron a hacer gestiones con la aseguradora y empiezan a decir, miren, nosotros tenemos un proyecto que creemos fielmente que es un proyecto de alta calidad, de alta integridad, y que queremos que el mercado lo reconozca así. Y empezaron a trabajar con la aseguradora para montar el producto de estos seguros de créditos de carbono. Nosotros nos vinculamos a ese proceso hace 3 meses, ellos ya venían adelantados, y empezamos a trabajar también con la aseguradora hasta que hoy estamos haciendo el anuncio.
¿Por qué crees tú que un hito como este se da en nuestra región, en Latinoamérica, con una compañía local, además con alcance global, pero colombiana en este caso? ¿Qué es lo que lleva a que eso ocurra con ustedes y no con otros?
Yo creo que nosotros tenemos una gran ventaja de hacer una compañía que es un estándar nuevo, emergente. Bueno, no tan nuevo, nosotros llevamos 7 años en el mercado, pero digamos, frente a esos estándares tradicionales, somos estándares emergentes que tenemos una capacidad de adaptarnos mucho más fácil y una capacidad de innovar mucho más fácil y mucho más rápido. Este tema de los seguros ha estado muy reciente dentro del debate de los mercados de carbono.
Sí, lo escuché en varias de las conferencias.
Se ha venido hablando de 6, 8 meses para acá. Y nosotros vimos la oportunidad de movernos rápido, además de tener la confianza de que nuestro sistema de certificación y nuestro ciclo de certificación y nuestro, digamos, marco normativo es lo suficientemente robusto para darle la confianza a las aseguradoras de poder asegurar el producto. Fíjate una cosa, las aseguradoras, para poder asegurar un proyecto, hacen una debida diligencia, un due diligence. Y ellos se fijan que todas esas promesas que están contenidas en el proyecto, de que se hizo consulta con las comunidades, de que se hizo el cálculo según las metodologías, de que se cumplió con los requisitos de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, que eso realmente se haya dado. Entonces hace años todo un estudio y ellos dicen el proyecto puede ser asegurado porque obviamente el riesgo es un riesgo bajo.
Cuando hablamos de los mercados de carbono, y aquí partí del macro al micro, ¿no? Hay mucha gente que todavía se cuestiona, que no los termina de entender, que dice, bueno, pero no deberíamos estar evitando contaminar más que estar pagando bonos por lo que ya contaminamos. ¿Cómo se puede explicar eso de una manera muy sencilla para que tal vez le quede claro a todo el mundo?
Claro. Mira, reducir una emisión o reducir una tonelada de CO2 emitida a la atmósfera en mercados como el europeo o como en Estados Unidos es muy costoso, porque son tecnologías maduras, porque generar incrementos en eficiencia son muy pocos. Entonces, pero en otros contextos, por ejemplo en nuestra región, es mucho más económico reducir una tonelada de CO2. Entonces, lo que hace el crédito de carbono es precisamente brindarle un flujo de recursos a esas actividades que pueden ser desarrolladas y que económicamente pueden ser factibles. Entonces, eso te ayuda a dinamizar proyectos donde sin los mercados de carbono no se pudiesen realizar, ¿no? Eso como primera medida. Como segunda medida, hay un estudio de SBTI donde demuestra que las empresas que compensan, ¿cierto? Hay un mayor índice de esas empresas, o sea, de todas las empresas, las que compensan son más propensas a hacer actividades ambientales y de reducción de huella. O sea, las que están compensando no solamente compensan, sino dentro de su política corporativa también están reduciendo sus objetivos y su impacto en términos de huella de carbono. ¿Y qué es lo que compensan? Lo usan para el remanente, para poder cumplir los pledges o las promesas que han hecho. Entonces yo creo que el mercado ayuda a dinamizar muchísimo y sobre todo un beneficio para nuestras economías, las de la región, de América Latina, que nos ayuda a tener flujo de recursos para implementar proyectos que sin esos recursos no los pudiéramos implementar. Energías renovables, reforestación, conservación de los bosques, nuevas tecnologías de transporte, todo eso nos ayuda y lo podemos ver como un mecanismo de financiamiento climático porque lo es para poder transformar nuestras economías.
Qué bueno, porque además entiendo que con lo que me estás explicando se contagia un poco dentro de la organización y fuera también el hecho de tomar opciones por el medio ambiente en pos de... Hay quienes todavía consideran que esto es como... hasta un poco hippie, hasta esto de querer ser muy idealistas y querer cuidar el medio ambiente y el planeta, cuando lo que hay detrás es una empresa y un negocio que tiene que cumplir con compromisos económicos, con compromisos con sus trabajadores o colaboradores. Por lo tanto, en ese sentido, el hecho de participar dentro de los mercados de carbono, el hecho de direccionar o focalizar en compensación, por ejemplo, hace que un negocio sea, que muchos podrían temer, menos eficiente, que sea simplemente una idea que se le ocurrió al CEO o al fundador o al desarrollador de sostenibilidad de la gerencia, o es algo realmente que tiene que ver y está relacionado con el core business de una empresa.
Claro, ahí toca un punto bien importante porque yo creo que hay de todo un poco.
Okay.
Yo creo que hay los que no conocen y dicen necesito comprar unos bonos de carbono porque
para pintar la hojita verde.
Exacto, porque necesito, pero yo lo veo un poco diferente. Yo lo veo que estos mercados no dejan de ser complejos y el entendimiento de cómo funcionan los mercados tampoco, pues, ni siquiera para las empresas o para muchas empresas, la generalidad de las empresas es fácil de entender. Entonces, el hecho de que tú tomes una acción de compensación es porque tú tuviste que analizar todas las opciones, porque tienes una política ambiental corporativa, porque te trazaste unas metas frente a la disminución de tu huella y porque estás tomando acción al respecto, ¿no? Entonces no es lavar, algunos pueden hacerlo, no lo vamos a negar, pero la generalidad y lo que demostró este estudio es precisamente eso. Lo que los están haciendo, los que están compensando es porque están tomando acción y en comparación con otras empresas que no están compensando, en realidad tienen más direccionada su estrategia ambiental corporativa, objetivos también de descarbonización internos dentro de la empresa, que significa eficiencias energéticas y demás. Entonces, los mercados lo que están generando es también generar un cambio en el comportamiento de las empresas. Hay diferentes tipos de mercados, están los voluntarios y están los regulados. El mercado regulado europeo, el ETS europeo, lo que está logrando es una transformación productiva de las operaciones de las empresas que tienen una cuota de emisión y que si no la cumplen, el costo del permiso de emisión es muy grande, cerca de 80 a 100 dólares. Entonces, esto está transformando y es como un instrumento que te ayuda, uno de los tantos instrumentos que te ayuda a transformar y a hacer un incentivo para transformar la forma como hacemos las cosas.
Cuando pensamos en la región, ya nos decías que esto ayuda a que el flujo vaya a generar proyectos, a financiar proyectos medioambientales que de otra forma no se podrían llevar a cabo, y que la posibilidad de disminuir la huella de carbono dentro de una empresa en Latinoamérica, todavía pensando en que podemos acceder a mejores tecnologías, a procedimientos más eficaces o eficientes. Tenemos un tramo muy grande todavía por avanzar, pero esto nos lleva a ser una región más eficiente para tu gusto. ¿Cómo nos vemos planteados frente al mundo?
Ok, yo pienso que América Latina ha dado pasos muy importantes. El ejemplo de Colombia es un muy buen ejemplo. Colombia implementó un impuesto al carbono y al mismo tiempo un mecanismo de compensación, que significa que tú puedas pagar el impuesto al carbono a través de certificados de emisiones, los certificados de gases de efecto invernadero. Y eso generó todo un mercado que ayudó a generar más de 200 proyectos en el país que actualmente se están desarrollando. Proyectos de reforestación, proyectos de conservación de áreas naturales, proyectos de transformación energética. Y eso ha ayudado al país a, de alguna manera, que las empresas tomen acción climática. Lo mismo está sucediendo en México, está sucediendo en Chile, en Brasil está sucediendo. Entonces, yo creo que sí se está generando como una tendencia en la región a profundizar sobre esto. Y los gobiernos cada vez están reglamentando más sobre estos mercados. Y el caso chileno es muy interesante. En Chile recientemente se adoptó un impuesto al carbono y un mecanismo también de compensación. Pero además Chile está trabajando en una regulación para poder participar en lo que se llama el artículo 6 del Acuerdo de París, que es transacciones entre países, bilaterales entre países, para poder obtener flujos de recursos de otros países que son compradores en proyectos que se desarrollen en países como los nuestros, que son vendedores. Exportar.
Bonos de carbono.
Y me gusta que me hayas dicho esa palabra, porque esto puede convertirse en una oportunidad de un nuevo sector económico en nuestros países. Un nuevo sector que no es el comercial, no es el industrial tradicional, sino ver el sector ambiental como un generador importante de divisas y un generador importante de inversión en nuestros países. Si la política pública está alineada, se alinea con los mercados bajo ese propósito, podemos lograr eso.
En este especial de bonos de carbono, esperamos haberles dado un panorama de lo que está ocurriendo en el mercado de la región, pero también a nivel global, que es muy dinámico y del cual, por supuesto, estamos muy pendientes. Nos vemos en un próximo episodio de Sustentablemente. Que estén muy bien.
Escuchaste conversaciones que inspiran y nos invitan a tomar acción en el cuidado de nuestro planeta. Esto fue Sustentablemente, junto a Carolina Escobar, un podcast original de Radio Pauta.